Hello, my name is Brian Carpenter, and I'm the curator of Native American materials here at the American Philosophical Society. Welcome to the third day of the APS's virtual symposium, The Promises and Pitfalls of Citizen Science. I'm very glad that you've been able to join us today. The American Philosophical Society resides in Lenapehoking, which is the homeland of the Lenape people, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. The APS acknowledges with respect their continued presence and perseverance, and we express our sincere thanks for the past and ongoing generosity of numerous Indigenous communities and individuals who have offered their guidance, expertise, and opportunities for collaboration. This week's conference is inspired by the Society's 2021 exhibition, Dr. Franklin, Citizen Scientist, and it expands upon the exhibition's themes by exploring understandings of citizen science over time, placing historical initiatives in conversation with present-day projects, as well as reflecting on the future needs and opportunities of the movement. For those joining us for the first time, the American Philosophical Society was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743. The Society is a catalyst for the discovery of new knowledge. Election to membership honors those who have made exceptionally significant contributions to science, the arts and humanities, and public life. The Society promotes research by providing over $1 million in research grants every year, primarily to younger scholars who need the support the most. Our library and museum collections and research centers serve scholars and visitors from across the globe. Please visit our website, amphilsoc, amphilsoc.org, to learn more about what we do and for news of forthcoming events. We are using Zoom webinar today, so don't worry, you've all been muted. If you have a question, you can use the Q&A button, which is found at the bottom center of your navigation bar. You can type your questions in there at any time. There will be time at the end of the panel for questions with our speakers. We also encourage you to keep the conversation going on the APS's social media using the hashtag CitSciAPS, that's capital C-I-T, capital S-C-I-A-P-S, CitSciAPS. Papers for today's speakers are available for download from the conference website and may be accessed using the passcode CitSci 2021. Finally, we're excited to offer closed captioning for this conference. If you would like to use it during the panel, please click on the CC box on the bottom navigation bar of Zoom. It's to the right of the Q&A button. With that, it is my great pleasure to introduce the presenters for today's panel on community perspectives. Our first presenter is Shandin Pete, who is Salish and Dene. Shandin Pete was raised and resides on the Flathead Indian Reservation in Arley, Montana. He completed a MS in geology and a Doctor of Education in Curriculum and Instruction, focusing on science education at the University of Montana. He is currently an affiliated faculty member for the Organismal Biology, Ecology, and Evolution program as a part of the Division of Biological Sciences at the University of Montana. He is also an independent researcher and co-founder of Tribal Research Specialist, LLC, providing ethnographic and educational research and consultation. He is also the producer and host of Tribal Research Specialists, the podcast. It's a great podcast, a show that discusses matters important in Indian country, including reclaiming research traditions, highlighting tribal values, and bringing forth to the forefront issues for the current state of affairs in tribal communities. From 2008 to 2020, he served as faculty at Salish Kootenai College, where he co-developed their hydrology program and founded the Indigenous Research Center on its campus. Dr. Pete continues to advance understandings of Indigenous research methodologies from Salish philosophical commitments with an emphasis on environmental and geoscience disciplines. Our second presenter is Evan Roberts. Evan Roberts is an assistant professor of sociology and population studies at the University of Minnesota. He has been working with citizen science data for nearly 2 decades, with experience developing crowdsourced genealogical data into social science data sets. Since 2015, he has been the leader of the Measuring the Anzacs project, which aims to transcribe 600,000 key pages of New Zealand World War I personnel files. Currently, he is co-leading a 2-year NEH workshop called Building Capable Communities for Crowdsourced Transcription to launch more citizen transcription projects on the Zooniverse platform. Our final presenter is Penelope K. Hardy, a historian of science, technology, and medicine focusing on technologies of science, ocean sciences, and scientific exploration of the global ocean, and an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. Her current book project on ocean sciences in the 19th and 20th centuries focuses on the role of ocean-going research vessels in the development of modern scientific understanding of the oceans and the ocean atmosphere system, and in the establishment of oceanography as a field. Her academic fields of interest include the relationship between science and the public, the role of technology in American society, the professionalization of science, and changes in popular understanding of the deep oceans. And with that, I will hand it off to our first presenter, Shandin Pete. Shandin, take it away.
All right, thanks for that great introduction. I feel sorry for you for having to read all that. That's a lot of words to read. I don't think I've ever read through that myself. I don't know, we tend to type things up rather wordy, but thank you for that great introduction, and thanks for the American Philosophical Society for hosting this conference. It's a good opportunity for me to get some ideas that have been on my mind for a number of years. I could say maybe even a lifetime, thinking about these things. So this will be a great chance to field some questions about things that have been on my mind. So first of all, one of the important things I think that are relevant in this conversation is this idea of science viewed as more of a human endeavor rather than from any particular society or race of people. I think it's more of an advancement of understanding our world. I think societies and cultures both approached it at different angles, and I think that's where I'm coming from, and I'm trying to understand or figure ways out to communicate what tribal science is, and particularly from a philosophical standpoint from my tribal community. Next slide, please. So in this understanding, I think one of the important things, again, to note is that I sincerely object against comparing ways of knowing or ways of thought or thinking against one another, but rather finding where these different understandings overlap. In this overlap, I think we can locate what's called the edge effect. In ecology, in general, it usually is where two habitats overlap. Generally, you see a greater amount of diversity within those overlapping areas. So examining both tribal science or community science or citizen science, however we want to term that, I'm interested in understanding where Western science overlaps with our own community understanding and tribal understanding from the traditions that we've all grown up to know and embrace. So really understanding the worldview of tribal people is really where I'm focusing most of my attention, and my ability to communicate that forward to other disciplines, other people, is a very important matter to me. Next slide, please. So a lot of the well-known scholars in this area of indigenous science or tribal science understand that the tradition of research or the methodological approach toward research all involves some level of cultural understanding, tribal values, or behaviors that may be unique to tribal communities. That's a prevalent statement in the research that we see today among scholars in this area. However, there's been a nagging disappointment in myself, not being satisfied in the literature. Uh, I suppose you could say it seems to lack depth in really understanding what these cultural protocols might be, what are the prevalent values, and how they play into how we come to know a number of things on the landscape. And I guess understanding the the reason why that is lacking in the literature, I think, is apparent just in trying to write up this little piece in 15 pages. It becomes quite the ordeal to I guess cut different parts out of uh, out of the paper. You just can't seem to capture everything in a written piece. So again, trying to define something in words and in written form, you tend to lose context, and then again, once you put it in a specific definition, the whole meaning and flavor of a philosophical tradition can be lost. Next slide, please. So, in my first attempt at trying to illustrate what a tribal worldview or a tribal philosophical understanding is in relation to tribal science, starts at really understanding how Western science views their own philosophical understandings, and try to put it in that framework, so as a means to communicate that easier to other disciplines. Next slide, please. So the first philosophical tenet, I guess, would be the tribal worldview, or the ontology that operates in our communities. So this attempts to answer the question of where really is the edge of reality, where is the fence that we don't go across, the things that really don't matter to us, that don't operate in our tribal societies. Where is that fence, and how is it built, and what are the things that maybe help us to move that fence closer to us or farther away? So that's the first thing we want to be concerned with. Next slide, please. So in that, we have to understand something about the tribal cosmology of our people, which is really developed from the creation stories. So the creation stories are I guess you could liken them to fables, I guess, but they're embracing the community as true and real history, and they explain things such as how constellations were formed, the creation of the sun and moon, which play into the idea of temporal thought, and how we forge our relationships with this boundary of reality. Uh, and then we have to start examining these stories closer to develop what we learn from these stories, and how that guides what we should know and what we can know within that tribal cosmology, and within the things that are embodied in those stories, which are largely stories about animals and how they created certain things, or provided demonstration of virtues and values that were going to be important for us as humans in the phases of creation in which we see in our society and culture. Next slide, please. So some of these slides got a little fouled up here. Some of the text is not showing up correctly, but that's okay. So in this ontological view, we develop ideas of time, how far back in time we look, and how far forward in time we look. And from these stories and our understandings, generally we only look back into time about 6 generations. Anything past that is beyond things that matter. And when we look forward in time, based on the creation stories, we're only looking at an annual cycle. So generally, tribal people in our community, we become concerned more so with the year ahead, rather than planning for 2, 10, or 5, or 50 years ahead. Next slide, please. So all these stories then provide us with a set of values that we operate off of, that define things that are good in our society, things that are bad, and what we should really strive toward. So they help to operate knowledge within our community about what is important and what is unimportant. Next slide, please. So this leads us to the epistemology, or the pathway to knowledge. So how we acquire knowledge and how we characterize truth. Next slide, please. So in this diagram is my attempt at trying to illustrate how the pathway to knowledge and truth work. So this is comprised of some familiar elements to tribal people and familiar elements to both non-tribal people. Next slide, please. I'll walk you through this very slowly. So in the first part of this diagram is the idea of the individual thinking both logically and both emotionally based on what we see in the outside world. So we categorize things and we put things in order, but we also have experience with the physical world, both emotionally and intuitively. Next slide, please. So when we examine something on our landscape or have some interaction, we have to verify that truth with our community, which is the X's on the graph, which is teepees. So to validate anything that we experience in our realm of reality, we have to verify that truth. Again, all that built off of a higher power from the stories of creation. Next slide, please, which is the top symbol. So again, to access truth in any sort of way, or to seek guidance, I guess, in a spiritual way, we're always looking, we're asking for truth and guidance from a higher power, but the gifts of truth, both in physical and metaphysical form, are manifested in the environment in which we access. That is the kind of the manner of, I guess you could liken to our prayers or our wishes. We're always asking for something to happen physically to us or to someone else in a positive way, and that is provided for us on the landscape. Just as the stories of creation narrate for us how all things were created on the earth for us to be engaged in, just as any other entity on the earth, deer, trees, rocks, anything. We're just integrated within that larger framework of truth. And I think that's the last slide. So I thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing more questions. And for a deeper understanding, please read the paper that's supplied. Thank you.
Okay, I'm on now? Okay. Right, so I'm Ivan Roberts, and I'm going to be talking about some of the early history of the engagement of sociology with citizen science in the early 20th century. Next slide, please. So just to sort of illustrate some of the relationship between sociologists and citizen scientists, citizen social scientists in the early 20th century, these are quotes from two men who later became presidents of the American Sociological Association, and so very much in the mainstream of sociology. Carl Taylor identified that one of the problems of working with local volunteers was that field workers who were collecting data in local communities didn't know the broader national and world context and the sort of the social problems on a larger scale. Next slide, please. Ernest Burgess, who was also a Midwestern sociologist, later president of the ASA, and so very much in the sort of the mainstream elite of sociology, thought that there was an opportunity to work with citizen social scientists. But no, what he's saying is that local conditions and needs, and he placed the emphasis here himself, this was highlighted in italics in the original text, 1916, should be studied by the community under expert direction. So a clear role for sociologists in setting the structure and the mechanisms for how data would be collected. Next slide, please. So what was the social survey? Social surveys in North America and Europe began around the 1890s. There's hundreds of them, particularly in the United States. It's less common in Canada, but there's a lot in Europe as well. And they were conducted by well-educated middle-class people. There's a lot of connection with the social welfare movement, and charity movements, and churches. And they were studying the social problems of local communities. And so there's a very sort of citizen science aspect to this in terms of the definition of the problem. Local citizens defined what they were studying, and lots of local people who were not affiliated with the academy, but were affiliated with charity organizations, churches, and the like, were involved in data collection. Next slide, please. However, there were tensions in this relationship, and they're well identified here by Warren Wilson, who studied under elite sociologist Franklin Giddings at Columbia, and then played a role in the Presbyterian Church's social outreach work in the early 20th century. Wilson himself published some sociological studies, but was not appointed to an academic position. And the problem that he identified was that local communities wanted to study their own problems, whereas, and you saw maybe a little bit of this in what the sociologists were saying, sociologists wanted to use this as a sort of a vehicle for theoretical sociology, accumulating knowledge across local communities, and making broader statements about social relationships and social structures in a variety of places, more general laws of social behavior. Next slide, please. Similar tensions identified by Taylor, that the data collection done by volunteers might not be as accurate, but for addressing local problems, when these studies were conducted by people in the community, they would be received better precisely because they had done by people in the community. And this is what he's saying about the community consciousness has been aroused. And so the very act of having local people involved in collecting data, interviewing people, itself addressed the problems that people in local communities, cities, towns wanted to address. Next slide, please. So what was the role then of professional sociologists in relationship to the enthusiastic and incipient social survey movement? Again, Burgess and Taylor provide some wonderful sort of perspectives. And I think Burgess's perspective, again, from his article, that this professional sociologist will be like a coach to the football team, perhaps the sort of Ohio State influence when he was writing at this time coming through in using that analogy. Taylor identified that what the professional sociologist could do was specify how questions were asked. And you'll notice, and here's a really key thing that will transform how sociologists engage with citizens scientists later on. Taylor wanted communities, because of this sort of the lack of trustworthiness of amateur collected facts, to stick to questions which had straightforward answers. So how much, how many, how often, and at what time. Things where there wasn't a great deal of interpretation that volunteers, field workers who didn't have the appreciation of the broader situation could mess up. Next slide, please. The other key role for professional sociologists was in sort of expert guidance on interpreting things. And so again, I think like Shandin, I've got some of my letters have not come through here. So Taylor contrasted that, three ways of representing the same fact about polluted water. And so you could have sort of the newspaper statement, which you can, I think, read there, just thoroughly polluted, a scientific writing perspective, and I'll read that out. Taylor said, scientific writing would put it as a bacterial analysis by the Sewage Commission has discovered there are 15,000 bacteria per cubic centimeter of water in the Harlem River. And then he says, he demonstrates with this example in his book that, data visualization, as we refer to it today, was a more effective way of communication. And sociologists had a role in helping local field workers, local communities do better data visualization. That was where professional sociologists and social scientists could play an important role. Next slide, please. Citizen labor was integral to the conduct of social surveys. This is sort of, well documented, but not in a great deal of detail. One exception where the people who contributed a lot of labor are actually named is a book about a social survey of Washington, Neglected Neighbors. And this is just the sort of the first page of specific acknowledgements to the work that individuals collecting data did. Next slide, please. What was more common was that this was acknowledged in passing. And so the Springfield survey, which was published by Russell Sage Foundation in hundreds of pages, 9 volumes, refers to over 100 volunteer workers. Robert Woods, many church workers. The numbers are imprecise in this case. Next slide, please. Sage, in the publication of the Springfield survey, gave a lot more detail about what volunteers did, and sort of echoes back to Taylor, the citizen role in engaging the community in the sort of the results and the meaning of the social survey. The volunteers played a key role in doing a public exhibition, and maybe a sort of a hint of the current event by APS, an exhibition is interesting here. So the volunteers did this and brought the results to the community. And there's a lot more detail about precisely what people did around that. Next slide, please. After around 1920, professional sociologists in their work in surveying local communities start to move towards student labor. And Manuel Taylor, again, sort of heavily involved in this movement, starts working in the pre-World War I with local communities. And then you can see in his individual surveys, the publications of those moves from volunteers to graduate students and undergraduate students. And I think this quote from his book about how you do these surveys is illustrative, that if you're working with volunteers, never ceasing care must be observed or fatal errors will occur. So fairly strong language. Next slide, please. A key part of all of these surveys, and I haven't really talked about this much, was what does a survey even mean? A lot of these surveys in the 1890s covered a lot of topics. They also included what we would think of as the sort of the modern meaning of survey, of a household questionnaire or a questionnaire to individuals, often about sort of economic matters, feelings, health status, and the like. And here's an example from one of the earlier and large social surveys, the Homestead Pittsburgh survey done by Russell Sage. And here you can see the questionnaire. Next slide, please. These early social surveys often published the results, these sort of individual tabulations, individual responses, hundreds of people. It's often a couple of hundred to 500 people who respond to these. And so they publish them in there. Citizen knowledge was important to collecting these surveys because there was no probabilistic sampling, there was no telephone directory, and local knowledge by leaders, business owners was necessary to find respondents to these surveys of individuals and households. Next slide, please. And so over time, these what we would think of as the modern meaning of survey became a more prominent part of the social survey, interviewing individuals and households. In the 1930s, in the Great Depression, and probability sampling is entering its heyday, there are increasingly ways to sort of list the population and draw random samples. And sociologists no longer have a methodological need for citizen knowledge about who's in the community. They have a list. The federal government is also sponsoring and conducting a lot of these probability surveys. And then after World War II, the surveys are remarkably accessible to social scientists at a range of institutions. And so these change the relationship between the sociologist and the subject in a multitude of ways. And there's a greater distance that emerges between the scholar and ordinary citizens. Next slide, please. And so what had been a sort of a moment of promise for sociological engagement with citizen science within about 10 years, and certainly by World War II, has vanished. We are now in an era where cheap probability samples are no longer as high quality as they used to be. Sociologists are doing a lot more ongoing panel studies, and that again sort of deepens the relationship the scholar with the subject. Calls for public sociology, which have been a little distinct from citizen science and the humanities and the sciences, have renewed interest in collaborating with the public on what are problems that we need studied, and to disseminate our research for a broader audience. And in terms of data collection, a problem identified by Taylor and Burgess and Manuel Elmer, now with computerized technology, we can get away from those fatal errors to a much greater degree and trust volunteer field workers to do some of our data collection in a mutually productive way. And so I think the time has come for a sort of renewed engagement of the social sciences with citizen science. Thank you.
Good afternoon, I'm Penelope Hardy. And I'm going to talk about the oceans as an inherent site and subject of citizen science. Human knowledge of the oceans is frequently compared unfavorably to our knowledge of the surface of the moon or of Mars. Part of the reason for this dearth of knowledge is the extreme difficulty of accessing the seas, much less the depths. I argue here that because understanding the global oceans requires a collection of distributed knowledge and relies on the experiential and working knowledge of those who make their living on, from, and around the sea, the oceans have historically been and remain inherently a site and subject of citizen science. Specifically, I identified two sometimes overlapping patterns of citizen science of the oceans. The first we might label participatory science, when scientists and their historical analogs depend on the skills, knowledge, and labor of non-scientists who live and work in maritime communities and occupations to reach, measure, and sample the sea. These might be sailors, naval officers, fishers, divers, or anyone else whose intimacy with and knowledge of the sea is tapped by scientists directly for knowledge or access to the deep. The second form is what we might now think of as distributed data collection. These are projects into which scientists engage individuals on and near the sea, who may thus fall into the previous categories as well, to collect data over a wide area as a means for dealing with the massive scale of ocean basins and phenomena. These two cases frequently overlap, but whether these maritime citizens are consulted individually or collectively, they're only rarely acknowledged as individuals, and much less often as collaborators, though it's their labor and expertise that have historically made the oceans knowable to science. Next slide, please. A notable early example, and one close to home at the APS, is Benjamin Franklin's effort to understand why sailing one direction across the Atlantic took longer than the return. Franklin turned to his cousin, Nantucket whaling captain Timothy Folger. The answer was obvious to a mariner with long experience along the American coast, the Gulf Stream. With Folger's assistance, Franklin depicted the current on a pre-existing map of the Atlantic, then published it in several editions over 2 decades, including one in 1786 in the Transactions of the American Philosophical Society. In the first few, he recognized Folger's contribution, but by the time of this map, Franklin just nodded anonymously to Nantucket captains who are acquainted with this stream. Joyce Chaplin has pointed out that Folger was a loyalist, so that may have led Franklin to leave him out after the American Revolution. Next slide, please. Projects like the 1835 tidal experiments coordinated globally by William Whewell represent the second way in which maritime communities were enlisted in the cause of science. Whewell enlisted thousands of participants from maritime and scientific communities on the shores of the Atlantic to measure tides at 650 stations simultaneously, every 15 minutes over a 2-week period. With the results, Whewell created large-scale charts of the tides that congregated thousands of individual data points into clean and apparently objective depictions of phenomena, devoid of the collector's information. Next slide, please. The practice of consulting whalers, merchants, and naval officers was programmatized in the mid-19th century in the charting efforts of proto-oceanographer Matthew Fontaine Maury. As an American naval officer, Maury was ideally placed to straddle the divide between science and craft knowledge of the sea. As new head of the US Navy's Depot of Charts and Instruments in Washington, Maury found a stockpile of old deck logs, which had been kept by ships and returned to naval authorities, but otherwise served little use. Maury set his lieutenants to harvest the data they collected that these logs contained, with which he made a series of charts displaying the winds, currents, temperatures, and other information at various times of the year. When he ran out of naval logs, he turned to merchant mariners and whalemen, whom he would supply with his Finnish charts and sailing directions in return for their supplying him with their deck logs at voyage end. Next slide, please. A few years later, Maury organized the first International Meteorological Conference, held in Brussels in 1853, to enlist the international maritime community in collecting similar data. The result was a massive increase in the amount of wind, current, temperature, and other data recorded by the navies of various countries over the global ocean. This contributed to Maury's ongoing project, but it also forms an important data set that modern oceanographers and meteorologists have begun to mine for historical climate information. And you can see the 1853 conference, sort of after that, the real tremendous uptick in the amount of data that we have available on the oceans. Next slide, please. In Britain, naturalists in the first part of the 19th century became increasingly interested in studying marine flora and fauna along the shore. But as their interest spread into deeper and deeper water, they turned to sailors and fishers for assistance. This came in the form of equipment, such as the adaptation of the oyster dredge to gather specimens from the sea bottom, but also in the form of boats and later ships. The Royal Society organized a dredging committee to coordinate efforts around Britain, and they developed a standard form on which individual dredgers could record information and then submit it. The Royal Society could thus become a center of calculation for the management of a distributed data collection network. Next slide, please. To reach the open ocean and to handle the unwieldy lengths of rope required to dredge its bottom, these naturalists formed a new kind of partnership with naval personnel, resulting in expeditions of varying lengths on ships supplied and crewed by national navies, with teams of naturalists on board. These scientific studies relied not only on the ship to reach the place of study, but also on the naval officers to accurately fix the ship's position on a chart so that measurements and specimens could be attributed to a specific location, and on sailors to operate the equipment with which soundings and samples were taken. The most extensive, and perhaps also most famous, was the 3.5-year-long scientific circumnavigation of the globe in the 1870s by HMS Challenger. And you can see I'm a victim of the shifting slide wording here too. The massive amount of data and numbers of specimens collected were farmed out to leading naturalists, not just in Britain, but also in Europe and in the United States, to write up the results. Publication of the entire set took 20 years and took up 50 large volumes. So this distributed calculation is perhaps another form of distributed science. Next slide, please. Another example of a global system that scientists could not begin to approach without the collection of data across an often hemispheric scale was the study of currents. One notable example was the work of Prince Albert I of Monaco, an oceanographic enthusiast who often partnered with scientists. Albert devised a way to crowdsource a study of currents in the North Atlantic beginning in 1885. Albert and the crew of his yacht Hirondelle deployed hundreds of floats into the Atlantic between the Azores and Newfoundland. The numbered floats each bore a message instructing finders to relay details of the float's recovery, where, when, in what condition, to the prince via diplomatic channels. Albert could then pair the details of each float's recovery with those of its launch, allowing him to calculate trajectory and approximate speed of the currents to which it had been subjected. In aggregate, the data gave Albert a detailed picture of the Atlantic current system and allowed him to describe the circulation later known as the North Atlantic Gyre. In addition to advancing knowledge of large-scale ocean systems, 30 years later, in the aftermath of World War I, Albert's ocean current work allowed him to predict the likely tracks of free-floating mines still loose upon the Atlantic. Next slide, please. The method was adopted by fisheries scientists around the world. In Japan, scientist Kamakichi Kishinui reported oceanographical work in relation to fisheries was done at first in 1892 to know the direction of ocean currents around our islands by drift bottles. In the Gulf of Mannar in the Indian Ocean, site of an important pearl oyster fishery, Thomas Southwell liberated numerous bottles from various locations between India and Ceylon over the years 1908 to 1910 in order to study the currents that ran with the seasonal monsoons. Southwell's co-author here was a naval officer, Lieutenant J.C. Kirkham of the Royal Naval Reserve. It was he who charted the currents as their drift studies revealed them, as you see here. Southwell also noted that the knowledge they gained from the drift bottle experiments was extensively supplemented by the observations of experienced coast vessel captains and by information on bottom currents from native pearl divers. This incidence of citizen science then fits into both of my categories, as beyond the study's reliance on the labor and cooperation of maritime communities along the edge of the Gulf of Mannar who found and returned his drift bottles, he was dependent as well on the specialized but non-scientific expertise of various maritime professionals. Next slide, please. Until the availability of satellite-based instruments and GPS tracking in the late 20th century, bottle drift studies became a standard method for tracing currents, such as the study undertaken in the early 1960s at the Bureau of Commercial Fisheries Biological Laboratory in Honolulu. Scientists there released 16,285 drift bottles in the Central Pacific to trace currents past the Hawaiian Islands. They hung posters in schools and public buildings asking potential finders to please kokua, or cooperate. Each of these cases relied on the public to assist and relied further on their eagerness to be involved in science. But as with the previous examples, the Honolulu-based scientists recognized their widespread collaborators in aggregate, but not by name. Science also has a long tradition of obscuring the work of assistants and non-scientists, those Stephen Shapin has called invisible technicians, in particular, even before the tendency in citizen science to recognize groups rather than individuals. In the case of ocean science, this has the effect of obscuring just how dependent those who study the oceans scientifically have historically been on those who know it through other means, as whaling captains, pearl divers, or other citizens of the communities who live and work on its shores. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, everyone, for a really great combination of papers. And we've got some really a variety of questions for all of the panelists, and we'll get to as many as we can. There's a lot of interconnections between these papers. I'm going to start off with one question for Shandin, and this relates to the way, I'll say how it's phrased and maybe add something here. The question was, who can be a scientist within a tribal community? Are there the same issues of authority and expertise as in Western science? And this may relate to a lot to the question in your presentation, you laid out an overall, really the fundamentals of an overall Salish perspective on how to know things, what kind of information should be valued, and a person's relationship to what's important. So I know you also mentioned, I've heard others mention that a key aspect is in this question of validating or verifying knowledge. It's also saying, who did I learn this from? So does this question of authority or expertise, I'm rambling on. I'll let you take the question from here. Can you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. You know, it's a really important one, and I forgot to add in my presentation, but it's in the paper that the information that I tried to speed through and in the paper is really an exemplar of how things ought to be, but it's not really how they actually are. The decline of the transmission of creation stories is apparent. The decline of traditional values is apparent. So that question about who can be a scientist, if I answer that from an exemplar standpoint, anybody could be a scientist, but it's really not up to an individual. If you think about it in a traditional way, a person can follow the virtues and the pathways to accessing knowledge in I guess in a spiritual manner, but it's really up to something outside of a person on whether they will be gifted or have an experience of truth in that way. So in traditional societies, that's kind of the way it was. You know, you're a vessel or a vehicle of knowledge that might help understand a phenomenon or answer a question that might be relevant in that time period. that still exists today, but in very small pockets in the community. And it's not as, I would say, not as strong or as powerful as it once used to be. We hear stories of our ancestors, no more than 5 or 6 generations back, of having an ability to control or influence weather in that manner. But that power has faded. So if we think about that today, on who could be a scientist, if we had that same pathway, someone could engage in that particular power, or get on that track of understanding and answer some of the tough questions that we have, or some of the phenomena that occur in our communities today, such as the effects of climate change, or helping to solve this phenomenon of missing, murdered and indigenous women in our communities. So anybody can be a scientist. It's just a matter of following these protocols, following the virtues and values of a community, and I think that still exists today. It's just the overlap of influence of Western understandings and technology has really taken over a large portion of that. I hope that answers that question.
Yes, thank you very much. That was great. I'll direct the next question to Even, and this is a question. The questioner asked, were there in the social surveys you outlined, were there inequalities in them? Were all local people involved, or was class, race, gender an issue? So this gets to the question of, was it, although these were people who are part of the community, was it really all of the community?
That's a great question. Tremendous inequalities in who was involved in these studies. The people who were involved in sort of initiating the surveys, data collection, tended to be sort of fairly elite members of local communities. If they were men, they were, and sometimes if they were women, more often college educated. So they were, or high school educated, often involved in local organizations, so sort of church, social welfare organizations. So these are folks who, have a sort of local standing. They are interested in social inequalities. I mean, they are concerned with issues, particularly of class. They're very interested in sort of the condition of the poor, and they, but there's the way I phrase it is sort of echoing their language, and they sort of stand at a bit of a remove. Issues of race. I mean, I will say that their interest is generally in sort of white communities. There is a sort of parallel tradition in African American communities. So Du Bois, does a little bit of work with volunteer labor, but also does a lot of his own data collection, and important to sort of acknowledge that with APS being in Philadelphia. But that was sort of unusual. I mean, he talks about how he does a lot of his own data collection, and of course a lot of sort of white social surveys are not of African American communities. Gender inequalities, I mean, they are documented about what women are doing. And the reason I sort of became aware of these social surveys was I was on the lookout when I was doing my dissertation for sources about women's work. And the census is not a great source. The census focuses on formal paid employment, and married women are doing that. But these local social surveys, which ask about sort of essentially any form of work and how much income did you earn over the past year, get into a lot more detail about sort of informal work, in work that's sort of irregular. And so sort of to conclude, the perspective of these local surveys, really offers a lot, because they're redefining the categories of what is work in a way that the official statistical agencies were not. Their view of what work was sort of like an ongoing occupation. And so, despite the blindness, and this sort of, that's a little ahistorical to some things that we are attentive to today, there are important ways in which these social surveys, do address important issues and sort of push the methodology forward.
Thank you. Next question is for Penn. The question is, the ocean is an international region, but clearly there are national interests involved too. So is oceanic citizen science more likely to involve numerous partners from many nations, or are there examples where citizen science was stymied because of national concerns?
That's a great question. And in general, ocean science, many people have argued, is the oceans are sort of an inherently international place, and so science should be as well. And there have been efforts on the formal scientific level to sort of form cooperative relationships across national boundaries in order to study the oceans, things like ICES in Europe. But certainly there are times, Prince Albert, for instance, is constantly trying to get other nations in Europe to participate in things like meteorological and oceanographic studies, where they would do something not unlike Whewell's tidal study, where they would all agree to take readings at the same time. And he'll get people sort of sound enthusiastic, but then not really do anything. So sometimes it's a matter of that. In terms of participation of people sending bottles back or collecting data broadly, they do get this kind of international cooperation. And frequently when we look at the historical examples, the sort of colonial and imperial situation also means that they can get a wide range of participants because of, for instance, where Whewell might have been able to contact people around the Atlantic because of the British imperial situation at the time. And certainly the situation where Southwell's looking at the pearl oyster fishery in Ceylon is very much because of sort of colonial context at the time. And there's an attitude there that they know better than the locals, so they can come in and sort of direct these efforts and figure things out that the locals couldn't. And so they're absolutely having participation across national lines, but often these sort of attitudes towards the participants that, like he refers to these skin divers, these native pearl divers, as his only source of information for currents on the bottom, since his drift bottles are only collecting sort of surface current information, but that it's really hard to get them to provide accurate information. And no doubt this is because of kind of that edge effect Shandin was talking about, right? That pearl divers and science, so the biological scientists have very different conceptions of what currents are and what's important about them and why they should be paid attention to. So it's partly translating across those sort of knowledge systems that makes this different. So I've gotten a little off your topic, but yeah, it's absolutely international. And I guess it's more that it follows the lines of any kind of international relations as to when it works well and when it doesn't. And whatever the international situation is at any time is going to influence the kinds and degree to which it's able to take place.
Thank you very much. Another question for Shandin, and this gets maybe to some, may point to some aspects that you're able to talk about more in your paper, such as like the edge effect and the sort of broader importance of communication among people about and having a good context that's better more than 15 pages you have to cram something into. So the question is, what are some of the challenges you've encountered in trying to find this overlaps with Western science, kind of what's within this edge that you've talked about? And are there particular areas where comprehension is hard or communication about that is hard?
Yeah, I think some of the things I said for the last question apply to this one as well. I think understanding that the reality of in tribal communities is really a blended reality where largely maybe folks outside of the tribal community can romanticize how we live or how we view the world, but where some people say we're dual thinkers or we live in two worlds, but I don't necessarily ascribe to that as much as saying that we're human just like everyone else, and we're influenced by our surroundings. And the more we embrace that, the more I think we can detract from providing this polarization of ways of knowing. And so really I think that's one of the greatest challenges is trying to combat the idea that I wouldn't say that that we're unique, but trying to combat the idea that we're so different, that our understandings are so foreign to each other. We do talk about things from the past, like I said, about this idea of weather control, or accessing this unknown power that's really hard to comprehend if you don't live in a community and engage in the ceremonial life. It's kind of hard to comprehend what that looks like and what that might mean and how that operates, and how it fits in with the Western science concept, where things are really focused on sensory data from advanced technologies. It's just not something that any sort of technological piece of equipment can really sense. But our own technology, our brains, and our ability to interact with the environment, we still have that ability to interact with that environment in that way. And it's a different way of seeing things, and it's not going to agree all the time with some of the ideas of Western science. But once you start looking at it and understanding it, you can see that they're very much the same. So I think that really is the biggest challenge, is just getting people to understand that we're all of the same species. We're so similar in so many ways, but also we have just this unique view among each group, and tapping into that and having people understand seems to be really important. And again, I'm not sure if that answered the question. I rambled, but that's what came to my mind.
That's all right. This is a space for rambling also, and all of the above answers the questions. Yes, that's great. A question for Evan. So in your presentation, you kind of showed how kind of some of these citizen science, or sort of non-scientist, non-classical scientist data collection things kind of shifted in sort of what the group of people was over time. So what do you think is, the question is, what do you think is lost in moving to student labor as one kind of sort of data collection group? Is there less investment, perhaps? Like not the same as like not as much as investment of like members of a particular community? Is there less investment in the questions asked or the responses generated, perhaps?
Yeah, and to their sort of their credit, everyone sort of involved recognized that working with students was not a sort of a panacea. That students might be well read in a sort of book learning sense, but they did not have the knowledge of the local streets. If you're doing a sort of a neighborhood study, that there was sort of an investment that had to be made in getting students sort of familiar with the area, that they would be going out and documenting and interviewing people in, so that they would sort of know when people in interviews referred to a particular place, they would know what that place was, that was the pool hall that was causing a lot of concern. I mean, there was a lot of, I don't bring that up as a random example, sort of pool halls, dance halls, bars were the kind of local social issues and problems that, sort of brought up in these studies. And so someone who's of the community will sort of probably know about that, but a student who's come to the University of Missouri or Minnesota or Chicago and is now sort of out interviewing may not know like what that place that's referred to is. So yeah, definite problems there, but it's sort of pretty clear in the sort of the 1920s as there's this move away from sort of volunteers doing data collection, that sort of citizen involvement in the problem definition phase of a social survey is really important, and so. Professional sociologists talk and write, I guess, about having students meet with sort of local leaders from churches, charity organizations, so that to address this problem, so that students know the social issues that are out there. And I mean, I'll just wrap up by saying that, I did a bunch of interviewing with students a year ago. A bigger problem was there was an inconvenient pandemic that occurred in sort of the middle of things. But I really appreciated that, like, students who come to a city for college, may not have gone out to these neighborhoods, and, you're sort of throwing them into a new, it's not a dangerous situation, but you're exposing them to something new and different, and they don't have that depth of experience there. So yeah, there's trade-offs, is I think the key.
Thank you. So we have time for one more question, and this was a question that was kind of phrased to all panelists, but I'm going to direct it towards Pen. I think of CO way. So the observation of the questioner was that there's a thread that's running through these papers is about who generates the questions of study, and what does your study of these different topics suggest who should decide. So in relation to your presentation, Pen, there's all these scientists who are dependent upon individual people or groups of people who had relationships with the ocean, with that landscape, but they weren't asked like what's a relevant question to ask. What would you say about this?
No, I think that that's true, and that's one of the sort of communication divide problems, is that the scientists are generally setting the agenda. Now, when it's scientists going out on ships, then clearly the naval officers or sailors have a certain amount of control over that. A fairly famous case early on is Edmund Halley, later of Halley's Comet fame, went out on a ship and somehow got himself declared the master and commander of the ship, and went out to study the global magnetic variation. And the sailors thought he was an idiot, so they basically ignored him, and he kept discovering that they were going a different direction than he'd told them to, and things like that. So there are plenty of cases. So generally scientists don't consult these other groups as to what should be the important questions. There are exceptions to this where they will ask what they know about a particular thing, or is this fish something we've seen often in these waters, or about the life cycle of a particular organism. But frequently they're more like Southwell and his pearl divers, and complaining that these guys just aren't giving me good information, when it might be partly about maybe they should try asking what are the important questions, or what would you think we should look at about the currents in the area.
Thank you very much. We have to wrap it up there. I want to thank all of our panelists for the really great presentations. We could talk about this for much longer, and we will share the questions with the panelists, and they may be able to respond to them afterwards individually to people if they're able. We're very grateful to all of you for joining us today, and for getting this conversation started and continued. And we look forward to having you at the rest of the conference if you're able to, and to future events. So thanks very much, and take care.